The hard question is not whether or not we should have used the atomic bombs to end the war. I think given the peculiar circumstances that we faced in the summer of 1945, given that this was a brand new weapon, that we had engaged in a tremendous amount of effort and expense in order to produce this weapon, I think in those circumstances, using the weapon was justifiable.
World War II is such an expansive subject that oftentimes the historical retelling of it seems to happen only in a limited scope. But your trilogy not only kind of focuses on the battle, land, sea, air, but also delves into the politics of the day, the media, how the global war was actually managed and run.
Well, it was, I thought it was an approach that needed to be taken, particularly with, with regard to the Pacific War. These are the kinds of histories that I like to read. Military history that isn't too strictly just about military operations, but also sets the larger context of the conflict. And so the idea was to tell a bigger history in which the military history would be sort of at the spine of the narrative. In what really is a very crowded literature, there's an enormous number of books that have been written not only on the Pacific War, but on every aspect, every battle, as you said. It was this new, fresh, different kind of narrative approach that I thought was clearly needed. And a narrative which pulls in all of these different elements and weaves it together into one narrative. I thought that was what was most needed at this point, where we've reached a sort of a point of maturity in the literature.
Who was the most effective and in turn least effective commander in the Pacific?
Well, historians have been hard on Douglas MacArthur, and I think that there are good reasons for that. He was, in addition to specific command failures that you can point to, particularly earlier in the war, he had these unbecoming character traits of vanity and deceitfulness, all of which has really been exposed in the historical record. Among the most effective, and I think those who really contributed in terms of American leadership to the victory in the Pacific, it's often those who were who kept a lower profile during the war. Admiral Ernest King, who was a difficult personality and really has been neglected, I think, by scholars and historians. It was really his vision for how to fight and win the Pacific War that ended up driving many of the most important decisions.
You recently wrote for the World War II Museum that it's not a question of yes or no, drop the bomb, but whether, there should have been a prior explicit warning. Can you elaborate a little more on that, and whether the Soviet Union played any kind of determining factor?
I think that there is clear evidence that many of the people around Truman and Truman himself saw the atomic bomb as a potential source of leverage against Stalin. It's clear that the principal factor behind our decision to drop the bombs was to end the war quickly and to do it with the least amount of further bloodletting. This dimension of the Soviet Union, I think these were secondary factors. They were present, but they were secondary. I think the hard question really has been, as you say, whether or not we should have explicitly warned the Japanese that we had the weapon before using it. And then even more so, I think the issue of using it against a city rather than against a purely military target. The arguments against dropping the bomb on a city rest on abstractions. How does this affect the long-term legacy of the United States in history? And of course, for veterans who were there, deployed in the Pacific, who believed that they might be sent in to Japan as part of an invasion force, for them, the questions, the issues were not abstract. They were issues of life and death.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT.
I think it was Truman who, obviously secondary, but he said if the American public knew that we had this weapon and I hadn't used it, what would that kind of backlash be against me?
Those political factors were very much in play. And one of the really fascinating counterfactuals is if FDR had lived, how might those decisions have been made differently? Because FDR, certainly by that point, really had very, very little concern for how these decisions would be seen by the American people, at least in the short run. He clearly wasn't going to run for president again.
In the days and the years that are to come, we shall work for a just and honorable peace, a durable peace. As today we work and fight for total victory in war.
I'd like to end kind of on one more of a slightly lighter note, but most of the world has been quarantining for the past 5 months. So I pose this question to you, that if you had to quarantine with one of the two, Douglas MacArthur or Ernest King, both kind of notorious, difficult personalities, who would you choose and why?
Well, I can honestly say that's something I had never considered. I would prefer not to be quarantined with either of those guys. I mean, I certainly would like to have the chance to sit down with them and interview them both. But 5 months in quarantine would be too much. I suppose if I had to choose one, I might choose MacArthur, just because I think that his intellectual interests were broader than King's. They were broader than just about any military commanders. He was very well read into history and a fascinating personality, and so I think that there might be more to talk about.